Thank you for tuning in for the December 2018 edition of Forage Focus. I'm your host, Christine Gelley, and today's guest will talk with us about rabies in livestock and companion animals. Stay tuned. Thank you for tuning in for our December edition of Forage Focus. Rather than talking about Christmas trees or how to prepare your pastures for winter, we're going to be discussing rabies, everyone's favorite holiday topic, with our special guest, Tim McDermott, who is a vet and extension educator for Franklin County. Thank you for joining us on the show today, Tim.
Thank you very much for having me down here at the South Centers.
Can you explain to us a bit about why we should be concerned about rabies?
Rabies is a disease that is an ancient disease. It's been around for 4,000 years, and because it is rarely encountered here in the United States, it's sort of fallen off in awareness and knowledge amongst producers or educators, and that's a good thing. There's been a tremendous amount of resources and finances put into eliminating rabies in the United States, but because it is a fatal and incurable, if not caught in time, disease, we like to make sure that we do periodic outreach on it so that producers, educators, veterinarians, and the public knows how to recognize the signs of rabies and, more importantly, know what they would need to do to make sure that their family, their livestock, and their companion animals are protected.
Okay, so explain to me a little bit more about rabies itself. Is that a bacterial infection? Is it viral? Is it pathogenic? How does rabies become an infection in an animal?
So, rabies is a virus. It's in the Lissa family of viruses, and like I said, it is ancient. There are reports of rabies back in the literature stretching out over 4,000 years, and they, even at that time, knew that a bite wound would be the transmission mechanism, most commonly from a dog. The virus spreads differently than when you think of a virus. So a lot of times folks will think of a respiratory virus where maybe there's a sneeze or a cough, or you touch a surface and you pick up that virus, and it enters the body either through the respiratory tract or through the digestive tract. Rabies is transmitted usually mammal to mammal, this is not a big avian disease, through an opening in the skin where the saliva of an infected rabid organism then enters the skin. And this is most commonly through a bite wound, but it also can be simply from handling an animal, touching the saliva of an animal where you would have some broken skin. And instead of using the bloodstream or the respiratory tract to transmit itself through the body, it's a neurotropic virus. So at the entrance of where the disease enters the body, it uses the neural pathways to slowly make its way to the central nervous system where it enters the brain. That's where it starts causing a lot of the changes that people see when they see a case of it, or more commonly what they've read in the literature. It then moves throughout the central nervous system, causing a lot of different unusual presentation signs. Some are characteristic, some are different in differing species. And then what it does is it ends up back in the salivary glands where it replicates in order to spread from host to host.
So about how many days would you say from the time that an animal or a person is infected with the rabies virus would they actually display symptoms?
So the incubation period in livestock, companion animals, humans, whoever gets bit is fairly variable. A lot of it depends on the amount of inoculum that they would take, and a lot of it really depends on where they would take the bite wound. The immune system of the host takes a little bit of a stab at trying to eliminate the virus, and you can have an incubation period that is as short as a couple of weeks, and the incubation can actually go out to months and months. So when we talk about rabies and how we want to make sure that we do the control of the spread of this disease, we really like to focus on the various ways that producers, educators, and veterinarians can promote the prevention of the disease.
Wonderful. So what's the best way for prevention?
So currently, rabies worldwide is still a tremendous health threat to humans. Worldwide, the majority of bites are caused by dogs. In fact, there are tens of thousands of fatalities caused by rabies over the course of the year.
Tens of thousands?
Tens of thousands of people worldwide die from rabies. 90% of those are caused, probably more than 90% are caused by dog bites to people. They simply don't have the resources that we have in the United States to interact with the wildlife with prevention programs, as well as to provide that large-scale rabies vaccine program that we have for companion animals. And it was similar that way in the United States, but not to that scale. Prior to the 1960s, here in the United States, the majority of rabies cases were canine bite wounds into people, and wildlife was a secondary reservoir. After we started a couple of different programs in the 1960s and through now, we started mandatory vaccine programs for canines with a sort of gradual phase-in of feline programs for vaccines. We have dramatically decreased the amount of rabies to where now 90% of cases, 95% of cases that are encountered are wildlife cases.
Okay, so if we track that chain back from, if we are detecting rabies in a bite from a dog to a person, how did the dog initially get rabies? Would that be from another dog in most cases, or would that come from the wildlife reservoir?
So over about the last 10 years of good data, the majority of cases of rabies that have been discovered in the nation and in Ohio have come in wildlife. In Ohio, in most counties, canine vaccination for rabies is the law, and you are legally required to vaccinate your dog and have a vaccine license for that and a tag that indicates that they have been vaccinated for rabies. So the majority of spread that we see would be caused by interactions with rabid wildlife. Over the last 10 or 15 years in Ohio, and I brought the list here, we have had positive cases of rabies in bats, cats, dogs, horses, ferrets, cattle, sheep, goats, swine, raccoons, and skunks.
Swine?
Swine.
I had never heard of hogs having rabies before.
You know, in a confinement operation, going to be less of a potential issue unless a bat might be able to get into there. Bats are an important vector of rabies. Now that we're seeing a little bit more pastured swine out there, interactions would not be uncommon, and I think the spread of feral swine in Ohio is causing a little bit more wildlife interactions with some of the swine producers, especially in southern Ohio.
Okay, so if we're doing the right steps, we're vaccinating our dogs and cats. Are there any vaccinations for our livestock if we know there's been an occurrence of rabies in our area? Is there something that we can do to protect those animals that make us money in our production systems?
Yes, so there are several different rabies variants that are out there that are labeled for use in most of the livestock species, and then there is some off-labeled use. So we have rabies vaccines that are labeled for use in dogs, cats, and ferrets and companion animals. And in livestock, we have cattle vaccines, we have sheep, and we have horses.
Are those available over the counter, or is that by prescription from your veterinarian?
Rabies should be given by a licensed veterinarian that assists with the record keeping and assists with the maintenance of the rabies control program we have here in Ohio.
Okay. As a aspiring shepherd, one of the concerns I would have after our conversation is either my sheep getting rabies from a dog in our neighborhood or from a coyote. So in order to prevent that from happening, I obviously should vaccinate my companion dogs. What would be the chain of response if I believe that my livestock have contracted rabies from a domestic dog in the neighborhood?
So when you think about livestock, you wouldn't really necessarily consider them heavily at risk for contracting rabies because they're herbivores and they're grazing out there. They're not really going to be into that big bite wound interaction with a lot of different wild animals. But livestock are very curious. And while a cow or a sheep or a goat or a horse would be very wary if they saw a human that they did not recognize or a predator in a pasture, if they were to see a small mammal such as a raccoon or a skunk, two of the most common rabies-carrying species in Ohio, acting a little funny in the pasture, their curiosity would probably lead them to go up and to investigate that. In Ohio, we have several species that have been tested positive for rabies in 2018. As of December 5th, just the other day, we had 51 positive cases of rabies in Ohio. The majority of cases that we had that were positive are bats. We've also had raccoons and skunks and 4 cats and 1 fox test positive in Ohio. So your cattle or your sheep or your goats grazing in the pasture, they might see a raccoon or a skunk acting unusually, and because they're not threatened by that species, they would go up and they might interact just to see what they're doing in their pasture. This can commonly result in a bite on maybe one of the forelegs or on the nose or the face. And then once that bite has been injected into the animal, it's going to start its neural pathway trying to get to the brain. The problems that you would have as a producer in terms of how you would protect yourself and your livestock operation from rabies, that could be difficult because it would be unusual for you to necessarily be watching your animals at all time while they're out grazing on pasture. And so it's important for the producer to familiarize themselves with the neurologic signs of rabies.
What are those signs, Tim? What are the things that you would notice first off that would tip you off that this might be rabies?
Unfortunately, a lot of the signs can mimic some of the other much more common diseases that you're going to see in livestock in Ohio. You might see some initial signs of dysfunction with a limb that would be neurologic but may look like a trauma or a lameness. Mm-hmm. You might see some general malaise signs where they're coming off feed or they're acting depressed or lethargic. It's very common that as it starts to affect some of the neurologic pathways, you'll see some neurologic dysfunction that, besides affecting the limbs, might affect how they would eat or swallow or hold their head. And for, say, a horse owner, your first thought process if you see a horse having problems eating or swallowing is going to be a choke. What does the producer do? They generally go right up to the face of the horse and they start investigating that. Other diseases that can cause that excess salivation, signs of choke, signs of dysphagia in livestock can be things like toxicity. They might eat something that they grazed on in the pasture that might be bitter and might normally be mistaken for that toxicity. There are some nutritional imbalances that can mimic some of those signs, and there are a whole host of neurologic diseases that can affect livestock, both large and small ruminants like listeria or something like that, that is going to cause the early signs of neurologic disease. Another common way that a producer might come into contact with live rabies virus would be if they were to find a dead animal or an animal that may appear to be dead but is actually paralyzed or suffering neurologic dysfunction either in the pasture or even quite commonly around the barn if you're talking about a raccoon or you're talking about a skunk or especially if you're talking about bats.
So if you need to remove that animal, what kind of protection do you need to put on your person to prevent contracting rabies?
That's a difficult call. I would probably not even go with heavy-duty gloves, knowing that the teeth of raccoons, skunks, bats, and cats can be very sharp and can penetrate most gloves, even a heavy-duty rubber glove like you would use for pesticide handling. I would probably use a shovel or something like that to remove that animal, and I would probably keep my distance and verify that it's dead prior to removal.
If you have an animal that you believe has a severe case of rabies and you're not able to get that animal treatment, would you recommend euthanizing the animal before you even try to approach it?
I would contact my veterinarian immediately if I have rabies on my list of suspected disease problems. And the reason is that, one, it's a federally reportable disease, and two, it is invariably fatal if you have an animal that's already showing neurologic symptoms. There really is no treatment that can be effective. Because of the human health hazard, we don't want any of the humans anywhere near any of these animals. So if you have any animal that you are suspected that you might have any kind of rabies worry at all, I would contact your veterinarian right away.
Okay. Do our local dog wardens and things like that, are they prepared to handle animals with rabies? We have a trouble in some cases getting a hold of a veterinarian that might be able to come out and actually check, well, do you have rabies or not? I'm busy with something else right now.
So for canines or for felines, I think contacting your local dog warden is a great response. My experience working with those folks in that line of work is that they are absolutely rock solid with handling, especially with handling of some fractious or feral animals, because that is how they do what they do as part of their job. I would make sure that if you did contact your dog warden, that you would relay that you have concerns about rabies so that they would know to make sure that they take the proper amount of protection prior to any handling that way. And if you are really worried about rabies with a wild animal, I would also consider contacting a first responder like a policeman, so that in case they need to handle that situation with force, that you have somebody who's trained to do that.
Now, when we're thinking about those wild animals that may be vectors for the disease, I've heard all the time, if you see a nocturnal animal walking around in the daytime, disoriented, that's a sign of rabies. Is that accurate?
It potentially could be accurate. Not every animal that you see walking around in the daytime that would be otherwise nocturnal is going to be a rabies vector. But because rabies will very commonly cause change of behavior in animals, I think that would be one of the first things that should trip you off that something is not right in that animal, and that would be a good first sign to avoid that animal.
Would a disoriented animal that has rabies still respond to a live trap? Do you think they'd be able to orient themselves into a live trap, or would they be so adjusted that they wouldn't make it in there?
That's a tough call. A lot of times when rabies has fully affected the neurologic function of an animal, they are not pursuing their normal activities and normal routines, and that includes eating or drinking.
I was thinking back to if we saw a strange animal around our place, strange wild animal, a raccoon or a skunk, our first instinct would be put a live trap out. But that probably isn't going to be helpful if it's a case of rabies.
That's hard to say, Christine. As long as you were very comfortable with what you were doing and you knew how to maintain a proper safety protocol, what you do on your farm is, I'm going to leave that up to you.
Then comes the disposal. So say if you were to do that, now you have a carrier of disease and a carcass to dispose of, and it's probably not good to just throw that on the dead pile if it has rabies, right? You're still going to need to call.
I agree 100%. You would want to contact your veterinarian. Submission of samples for rabies testing is done to the Animal Disease and Diagnostic Laboratory near Columbus, and there is a certain procedure and a certain way of doing that that needs to be followed. In private practice, I did encounter rabies rabies a couple of times, believe it or not. So when I went through vet school, we were vaccinated for rabies. We got a series of vaccines because we would be a frontline person that would encounter that, whether it's companion animals or livestock. There was 4 incidences, and most recently a 5th incidence, which was in my house, where I was contacted by clients because they had bats in their house. In all of the cases, they found this because their cats were playing with the bats that had gotten into the house through the chimney or however they had done that, and they contacted me and said, "What do I do?" And bats are probably the #1 wildlife repository for rabies virus in Ohio. And so I had to be very careful at counseling the clients that this is a potential rabies risk. We want to test that bat. We can't have the clients be in any danger whatsoever. If their animal did come in contact with the saliva or a bite wound, they would be at risk for rabies. And so of the 4 that were brought in, plus the one that I found in my house just last year, 2 of those actually were positive for rabies.
Wow.
And in all of those cases, the animals were vaccinated, and your veterinarian can work with you should you come into contact with a positive case. So understanding what species and how that viral vector might interact with your livestock operation or your family or your companion animals is a very important part of the protocol that you want to make yourself aware of so that that doesn't become a problem for you.
A point I'd like to make in regard to bats being a primary, or well, the highest vector in Ohio would be that people don't necessarily need to fear bats. They are very beneficial for our environment, but they don't really belong in your house. So you do want to seal off any entryways that might be appealing for a bat, provide alternative habitats for them to go to rather than your attic. You want to encourage them to be out in the environment, but not in your house. So.
Of the positive cases in Ohio, and there's an interesting geographic distribution of where they find rabies most commonly. Bats are noticed throughout Ohio. There was an introduction of a rabies raccoon variant that came in from Pennsylvania and still has some positive cases up around the Youngstown area. And the one fox that they found this year was up in that similar area up in Ashtabula County. What they did to combat the spread of the raccoon rabies variant was they dropped rabies vaccine bait up in that area. And that's been very effective at trying to eliminate the large numbers of raccoon rabies variant that we had up there. Hasn't completely eliminated that spread, but has radically decreased the amount of positive cases. It is still a vector, it is still a worry. You would still use all the proper safety protocols if you were confronted with a raccoon, even though we have decreased the numbers of rabid animals.
A question that just occurred to me was, is there a correlation between urban and rural environments and the cases of rabies? Is it more common in one area than another?
Honestly, I can't speak as much to that. All of the cases that I encountered in private practice were all urban in Columbus. And when I look at the geographic map distribution of the positive cases in Ohio, I do see more of a urban focus to those. Now, that could simply be population density, and when you mix population density with raccoons, which are naturally adapted now to live in cities, and bats, which are also naturally adapted to live in cities, we're going to see that probably skew the data a little bit.
Right. It makes sense that where there are more people and more companion animals, there will be more reports, and it will look as though there is a greater presence of rabies there, whether that's actually valid or not.
Yes. The important thing for a producer to do would be to evaluate the risk and talk to their veterinarian so that they can build a protocol that works for their production operation. We don't have, for example, rabies vaccines that are labeled for use in goats. There are some off-label uses of sheep vaccine or large animal vaccine that have been adapted that way. Rabies is part of the American Animal Hospital Associations and the American Equine Practitioners Vaccine Recommendation Protocols for equine. In most of the municipalities in Ohio, if not all, and it might be a state of Ohio law, dogs need to be vaccinated for rabies. Cats should be vaccinated. As I said, in practice, all of the rabies cases that I encountered that were positive was cat interactions. And with the natural play behavior that the cat had with the bats, my assumption would be that there was a potential positive interaction with the rabies virus.
Thinking about people who commonly interact with feral cats, I would get a little bit concerned about, there's always that lady in the neighborhood who's putting food out for the cats, whether they like her or not, and I might be a little bit concerned for her safety interacting with those animals. So maybe this holiday season, if you have somebody in your family or a neighbor that's that way, maybe share the message with them about the potential for rabies in animals such as those. Do you think that'd be good advice?
I think that is good advice. There are a couple of great online portals that will go into much more detail about how to protect your family, how to protect your farm from rabies. The Ohio Department of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention both have home pages that have fact sheets and details on symptoms and signs, what to do if you suspect rabies, how to get a hold of a veterinarian, how to do the submission samples for veterinarians so that they know the protocol, and a bunch of general warnings about what symptoms to recognize in all of the different species and how to go about getting vaccines for rabies as well.
One other question that I had for you before our time is up today, Tim, is does the Ohio Division of Wildlife have resources as well about rabies? Many of our Ohio hunters will consult the Ohio Division of Wildlife. Is there a way that they can report potential rabies through the Division of Wildlife, or have we seen occurrences in deer?
I am not aware of any deer positives in Ohio. I think that if you were to notice a deer that was acting strangely, that would be an important thing to do. I can't speak to what resources that ODNR would have or the Ohio Division of Wildlife would have that way. As a state organization, they would work fairly closely with the Ohio Department of Health. And I think that hunters getting out into the woods is another line of first responders, as long as they make sure that they follow all the same safety protocol and safeguards that we've talked about today for family members or producers.
So I think our take-home message for today is to be aware that rabies is still an issue in our communities, in urban and both rural interfaces. We need to be aware of that, vaccinate our companion animals, and if we know we have a concern, to do so as well for our livestock. And the big key to that is having a relationship with your veterinarian, right?
I agree. Rabies has succeeded in persisting for 4,000 years where it does not live outside the host. And it's a virus that kills the host. So you have an organism that is adapted to pass from host to host, knowing that it needs to get into the saliva, cause enough madness in the organism that it will bite another before it kills the organism. And when you think about it that way, you don't want to say that a virus or a bacteria would be inherently evil, but the fact that it has persisted 4,000 years by going person to animal to person throughout mammals shows some elite adaptation.
Well, if you haven't already, perhaps it's time to send your veterinarian a holiday card and reestablish a relationship with them. So thank you for joining us for our program today, Tim. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you all back for another edition of Forage Focus.